Hey fellow chess learners, welcome to our channel Pawnception. In the spring of 1924, New York was the center of a chess storm. Imagine it. The world's greatest players gathered in one hall: Capablanca, Alekhine, Lasker, Maroczy, and others. Among them, two brilliant minds sat down for a game that history would never forget. Richard Reti, the creative innovator, was about to face Efim Bogoljubow, a fierce and fearless tactician. This wasn't just any game. It was a battle of philosophies. Reti was a pioneer of hypermodern chess, the idea that you don't need to rush to occupy the center with pawns. Instead, you attack it from a distance with knights and bishops. Bogoljubow, on the other hand, was a practical fighter, unafraid of sharp battles. What unfolded over the board that day became one of the greatest masterpieces in chess history, a game so elegant, so full of ideas, that nearly a century later, it still inspires players everywhere. Richard Reti begins the game with the knight to f3. At first glance, it seems quiet, just a knight out. But here is the brilliance. In 1924, almost everyone began with pawns to e4 or d4, rushing forward in the center. That was proper chess. But Reti was different. He was part of the hypermodern revolution. His message was, why push pawns early and expose them? Let me develop a piece, stay flexible, and wait. I will control the center not with pawns, but with pieces. I will let you build your fortress, and later I will find the cracks. Think of it like the kings preparing for war. The old way: seize land immediately, raise your flag, and fortify. Reti's way: send out scouts, knights, and bishops to watch, probe, and wait for weaknesses. Right from move 1, Reti is already challenging the accepted wisdom of his era. And Bogoljubow responds with a classic: pawn to d5. This was the mainstream idea of the time: occupy the center, you control the board. If you dominate the middle, your pieces will have more space, more freedom. It's like a general marching his army into the valley, planting the flag. Reti immediately undermines that claim. He pushes pawn to c4, attacking the d5 pawn from the side. Notice the strategy. Instead of rushing to grab space himself, Reti lets black place a pawn in the center and then challenges it. It's a little like letting your opponent build a fortress and then building tunnels underneath it. A calm, solid defense. With pawn to e6, black supports his d5 pawn. He is not overextending. He is reinforcing. By playing e6, black does three things at once. He defends the pawn on d5, shoring up his central claim. He opens a pathway for his dark squared bishop to develop. He keeps his position solid, no weaknesses, no overextension. For beginners, picture this like reinforcing a castle wall. Bogoljubow already planted his flag in the center with d5, but now he is adding extra stone to make sure that wall doesn't crumble under attack. Notice the contrast here. Reti has developed a knight and is preparing his bishop with fianchetto ideas. His pieces are moving with agility, like archers taking position on hills. Bogoljubow, meanwhile, is building structure, fortifying the middle with pawns, like soldiers digging trenches. Reti now plays g3. This is another quiet but deeply meaningful move. He is preparing to fianchetto his bishop on g2, pointing it straight across the board toward black's queenside, and more importantly, the heart of the board. Think of it this way: instead of sending a heavy cavalry charge into battle, Reti is placing a sniper on a faraway hill. That bishop, once developed, will control the long diagonal, influencing both the center and black's position from a distance. Why is this important for beginners? Because it shows you don't always need to rush pawns into the middle to fight for it. Sometimes, pieces placed on strong diagonals can do the job just as well, if not better. Bogoljubow responds with knight to f6. This is a natural move. He develops his knight toward the center, aiming at the e4 square while also helping to protect his d5 pawn. Beginners should remember this. Knights love to be near the middle. From there, they cover more squares and exert more influence. But there is also symbolism here. Reti's bishop reaches g2. And with this, his plan from move 3 is complete: the bishop fianchetto. That long diagonal is now his territory. From g2, the bishop doesn't look aggressive yet, but it's like placing a watchtower on a high hill. It sees far, and at the right time, it can rain pressure down on black's position, especially toward that central pawn and d5. For beginners, notice the difference in styles again. Black has already placed pawns in the center. You're saying, I own this space. White's bishop is saying, fine, take the land. ITL control the skies. There is also a practical lesson here: developing bishops early, especially to strong diagonals, prepares your king for safety. And sure enough, Reti is getting ready to castle on the next move, tucking his king away and connecting his rooks for the battles to come. Bogoljubow calmly develops with bd6. At first, it looks simple. Another piece is coming out, another step in development. But notice where this bishop points straight toward White King's side, even though White has not castled yet. For beginners, think of it like placing a cannon on a hill, aimed not at the enemy's army right now, but at the camp where they are going to retreat. Reti castles. By castling, Reti tucks his king safely into the corner and brings his rook closer to the center. Bogoljubow now castles as well. The kings are safe. Now the real fight can begin by castling. Black does exactly what White just did, protect the king and connect the rooks. But there is more beneath the surface. When both sides castle on the same wing, it usually means the battle will be about control of the center, not wild pawn storms on opposite flanks. Remember that Bishop Bogoljubow placed on d6, pointing toward White King's side. Now that both kings are castled on the same side, the game becomes a test of timing. Can Black use that bishop to create pressure before White pieces squeeze his center apart? Reti plays b3. Now, at first glance, this may seem slow. Why move a pawn on the side of the board when the center is the real battlefield? But this is vintage Reti. He is preparing to fianchetto his other bishop, placing it on b2, where it will aim right at Black's center. Think of it like building a second watchtower on the opposite hill. Well, here, Reti placed his bishop on g2, looking down the long diagonal. Now he is preparing another sniper on b2, and together they will crossfire into the middle. Here is the lesson. Sometimes chess isn't about rushing forward, but about getting your pieces to their best squares first. A quiet move like b3 sets up long-term pressure. Now here is an interesting twist. Bogoljubow plays rook to e8. At first, this looks a little unusual. Beginners might ask, why move a rook when the center isn't even open yet? But this is a move with hidden ideas. By placing the rook on e8, Bogoljubow is preparing for a potential central break, specifically the push e5. That rook will back up the pawn, and if the center explodes, it will already be on a useful file. Think of it like shifting a battering ram into position before charging at the enemy gates. The strike hasn't happened yet, but the preparation is there. But there is another layer. While the rook move is flexible, it's also a little slow. Black hasn't developed his queenside pieces yet. G-knight on b8 and bishop on c8 are still sleeping. So Reti now knows he has a bit of time to complete his own setup before Black's army is fully mobilized. And now Reti's little pawn move b3 makes sense. He places his bishop on b2, and the board suddenly clicks into harmony. Bogoljubow quietly develops his knight to d7. At first sight, it's not flashy, but strategically it's important, like posting an extra guard behind the main gate of the fortress. Bogoljubow is saying, I see your hidden bows and arrows, Reti. I will thicken my walls and place my knights around them. Let's see if you can break through. After so much quiet preparation, scouts, snipers, pawns shifting into place, Reti finally moves his d-pawn into the heart of the battlefield. Pawn to d4 isn't just a pawn push, it's like the gates of his fortress swing wide, and his soldiers step into the valley to claim space directly in the center. What is beautiful here is the timing. He didn't rush this move on the second or third turn like a classical player would. Instead, he waited until both bishops were poised, his king was safe, his knights and pawns were coordinated, opens lines for his queen and rook. Now, when the pawn steps forward, it's not alone. It's an infantry charge covered by archers firing from the highlands. Bogoljubow answers, greet his central push with a defensive reinforcement, c6. With pawns now stationed on c6, d5, and d6, Black's camp resembles a mighty fortress, compact, solid, and hard to tear down. Reti continues with quiet precision. He brings his queen's knight from b1 to d2. At first glance, it looks modest. It also eyes c4, ready to hop into active positions if needed. And critically, it keeps the position flexible. And here Bogoljubow makes a statement. His knight leaps boldly into the center e4. This isn't a quiet development move anymore. This is a challenge, an intrusion. Picture a heavily armored knight on horseback galloping past the front line straight into the enemy's courtyard, planting his banner and shouting. It stares at key squares like c3 and g3. It challenges white bishops and knights. It gives psychological pressure. Reti doesn't hesitate. The intruding knight on e4 might look proud and dangerous, but to him, it's a reckless warrior who is ridden too far alone. So his own knight on d2 simply steps forward and cuts it down, nxe4. White refuses to let Black get a strong, stable outpost in his territory. Exchanging here clears the central tension and makes it easier for White to later open the board with pawn strikes. It keeps control of the position. Reti doesn't want to tolerate passengers living rent-free in his half of the board. Bogoljubow has no choice. He must recapture with his d-pawn. So the pawn steps forward and takes dxe4. This shift has a very dramatic feel. Black maintains a pawn in the center, showing control at least in appearance. An advanced pawn can sometimes cramp the opponent by blocking piece movement. Here, it cramps white's knight on f3 for the moment. But the pawn is also a responsibility. Now black has gained space but also inherited a weakness. Without hesitation, Reti leaps forward with his knight e5. This is more than just development, it is psychological and bold. Imagine a fearless warrior stepping onto the battlefield and standing chest to chest with the enemy's outpost soldier, practically saying, "You may be standing here, but this is my land. I dare you to push me away." The knight on e5 is an outpost. Once the knight plants in such a spot, it's like it sinks its boots into the ground and refuses to budge. Bogoljubow tries to drive out Reti's defiant knight by thrusting his pawn forward to f5. On the surface, it looks energetic. That pawn move doesn't just push the knight, it also weakens black's own defenses around the king. By moving the f-pawn, Bogoljubow leaves e6 and g6 vulnerable and creates dark square weaknesses around his monarch. It's as if in shoving forward his shield wall, he leaves behind gaps in the armor. Reti responds with a strike of his own, f3. This is the moment where the calm, quiet build-up turns sharp. Imagine black's pawns as a wooden bridge built out into enemy territory, as with the pawn on e4 as the furthest plank, and the pawn on f5 holding it up. This move attacks the very root of black's pawn chain on e4. If that pawn falls, the entire structure that black so proudly built will crumble downstream. By attacking e4, white tries to dismantle black's advanced pawn chain. If black captures zx-f3, white bishop on f3 will awaken with enormous scope, staring into black's vulnerable king side. The move changes the entire momentum of the game, switching from defense to counterattack in a single instant. Bogoljubow does what most players likely would. He accepts the pawn sacrifice. His pawn on e4 steps forward and captures white f3 pawn, dx-f3. It may have gained a pawn for a moment, but now it stands deep in white territory, far from support, doomed to be surrounded. Reti calmly recaptures with his bishop, bx-f3, and with that, a seemingly quiet piece suddenly awakens like a sleeping dragon. Bogoljubow now shifts his queen to c7 to steady his camp. Think of this queen move as the commander leaving the throne room and climbing up onto the castle walls to survey the battlefield. From c7, she can see across her own troops, give support to her pawns, and prepare to coordinate with the rooks. Reti makes a firm, strategic decision here, nxt7, trading his knight on e5 for black's knight on d7. Bogoljubow recaptures with the bishop, bxt7. Of course, he has no real choice here. If he doesn't retake, he drops material. But this recapture quietly deepens his problems. At last, Reti pushes forward with pawn to e4, and the entire board shudders. This is a central strike of enormous power, the kind he has been carefully preparing since move 1. Imagine a dam holding back water. For many moves, white has been gathering pressure behind the dam with his bishops, queen, and rooks. e4 is the crack in the wall. The first hole appears, and water begins to burst through, threatening to flood everything. Directly challenges black's pride pawn and e4 and the whole pawn structure around it. Bogoljubow doesn't back down. Instead of exchanging on e4 or retreating, he shoves forward e5. This is pure defiance. Black is saying, "You want to crack my pawn chain? No, I will lock it tighter." The pawn chain now stretches from f5, e5, d5, c6, a long iron wall across the middle of the board. Black strengthens his pawn on f5 by linking it with e5. He blocks white b2 bishop, 4 now, cutting off its pressure along the diagonal. He shows aggressive spirit, trying to seize central squares and prevent a total collapse. But here is the hidden flaw. By pushing to e5, no Bogoljubow creates new weaknesses behind his lines. The d5 square is fixed, and the dark squares around his king, especially g6 and e6, are crying out for Reti's bishops. This rigid pawn wall might look proud, but it has no flexibility. It cannot bend, only break. Reti calmly pushes his pawn forward, c5. Reti slams one of those gates shut. The black pawn on c6 is frozen in place, the bishop on d7 is locked behind its own walls, and the whole queen side suddenly becomes cramped and immobile. Restricts black's light squared bishop, it cannot develop naturally anymore. Gains queen side space, meaning later white rooks can infiltrate down open files while black is stuck defending. Reti ensures that the position is now frozen in a way that favors white fianchetto bishops. From this point onwards, black will be cramped, passive, and gradually suffocated. Bogoljubow slides his bishop backward from d6 to f8. At first glance, this looks harmless, but in reality it is a retreat born of necessity. His proud bishop, which just a few moves ago aimed menacingly toward white king's side, now shuffles back toward its starting corner, a quiet admission, "I have no good squares here." Reti calmly brings his queen from her starting place to c2. No rush, No attack yet, just quiet perfection in placement. Think of the queen as the general climbing a watchtower in the center of camp. From c2, she sees everything. Finally, Bogoljubow lashes out. He plays the xd4, exchanging off his advanced pawn. For many moves, with this capture, he tries to release some of the tension and create breathing space. It is as if the fortress walls were straining under pressure, and Bogoljubow orders a section blown open himself. A risky attempt to let out the pressure before Reti smashes through. But instead of relieving him, it opens escape lines for Reti's pieces, like an enemy opening a door and accidentally letting invaders rush in. Reti strikes with the xf5, a sharp and principled decision. For many moves, Reti has been battering it from afar. Now, with this move, he pulls out the support beam. It's like taking a hammer to the cornerstone of an arch. With that stone gone, the whole structure begins to wobble. Reti chooses the most dynamic continuation, which is opening the gates. Instead of grabbing the pawn back right away, Bogoljubow seeks counterplay by bringing his rook into the center Rad8. It looks logical. The rook lines up on the half-open d-file, staring at white bishop on d4, if it appears there, and supports his d5 pawn. It's as though black is saying, I may have lost some ground, but I will bring my heavy artillery forward before you crush me. But the problem is, this looks more active than it is. White's position is so harmonious that Rad8 doesn't generate real threats. The move feels like black trying to wave a banner to look strong while still being structurally on the back foot. This bishop move by Reti looks so simple, but it is ice-cold precision. The bishop shifts onto h5, quietly aiming its arrow at f7, the very heart of black's position, and at the same time supporting potential sacrifices on g6. It directly threatens queen moves, piling up pressure on f7 and h7, forces black into an awkward defense. Pawns cannot cover, so his pieces must shuffle and weaken squares further. Bogoljubow responds to Reti's creeping bishop in activity rd5. Picture a desperate fortress commander sending his heaviest armored soldier outside the gates to challenge the besiegers. Reti resists the temptation of a fast tactical blow. Instead, he plays bxd4, calmly recapturing the pawn and improving his position. This is vintage Reti: patience, precision, strangulation. Winker was siege where the attackers already control the battlefield. The flashy move like bf7 check would be a wild cavalry charge into the fortress. Instead, Reti says, no need. Let me just tighten the noose more. So he calmly places his bishop on d4, controlling open lines, stopping counterplay, and leaving black gasping. Bogoljubow finally decides to cash in the pawn with his rook rx5. The rook crashes onto f5, killing the exposed black rook at once. White eliminates black's only active piece. The f-file cracks open completely, right in front of black's king. The bishop on d7, the only one that can get there, is forced to take the white rook. Otherwise, he has just lost outright. But here is the thing. By recapturing, that bishop moves away from its defensive role, protecting the dark squares. The final barrier near the king's shelter is stripped away. Reti immediately recaptures with his queen qxf5. Now let's pause and admire this moment. White queen stands proudly on f5 in the very heart of black's position. The queen is supported by white bishops, creating deadly crossfire. The open f-file becomes white highway into black's camp. It's like the white queen is the conquering commander who has marched straight through a collapsed gate and is now standing boldly inside the enemy courtyard. Flags fluttering, while defenders scramble helplessly. Black is already on the ropes, but instead of shuffling passively and waiting to be strangled, Bogoljubow lashes out rxd4. It's a desperation move, the swing of a drowning fighter. Instead of rushing with a check like qe6 check, Reti plays the calm and crushing rf1. He calmly lifts his rook into the attack, doubling major pieces against black's already open king. Black retreats his rook from d4 back to d8. Imagine a cavalry raider who rode too far into enemy territory. Suddenly realizing the fortress is under immediate siege, he drops the loot and gallops back home as fast as possible. But it's too late. The enemy siege engines are already in place. White queen on f5 and rook on f1 still coordinate perfectly. Reti doesn't hesitate. He unleashes bf7 check. The bishop calmly slides forward with check, cutting directly into black's last fragile defenses around his king. It forces black's king into total exposure. The black king must step aside, kh8. The king staggers into the corner, but this is no refuge. In fact, it's like being herded into the final trap chamber. Imagine a king fleeing deeper into a burning fortress, thinking there is safety in the last hall, only to find it's a dead end, and the enemy is already at the only door. Reti finished with the killer move BA. The bishop slides forward, cutting right across the board. With that, the rook on f7 is trapped, it cannot move. Bogoljubow is helpless. His queen is overloaded, his king trapped. Resignation is the only option. This game isn't just memorable because Reti won. It's remembered because of the artistry, the harmony of white pieces, the dazzling sacrifices, the way every move built upon the next in perfect coordination. It's a textbook example of hypermodern chess. Reti let black take the center and then carefully dismantled it piece by piece until the final brilliant attack. When spectators recall the great masterpieces in chess history, this game always shines among them, not because it was flashy alone, but because it had soul, logic, and beauty working together. And that's why, even a century later, the game of Reti versus Bogoljubow, New York, 1924, stands as one of the immortal gems in the treasury of chess. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to see more chess games broken down, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a move. Drop a comment which move shocked you the most. I would love to hear what you felt during this beautiful game. And remember, every piece tells a story. What story will your next game tell?